of Jewish and Holocaust Studies minor at Middle Tennessee State University. Her most recent book, which sounds really interesting, is What Price Hollywood? Gender, Sex, and the Films of George Coker from the University of Kentucky Press 2020. Her paper is titled Jewishness, Survivor Guilt, and Billy Wilder's Ace in the Hole. Please.
Thank you. Well, had I known earlier that there'd be two silent film papers, I could have wished to present on Alla Nazimova, perhaps, or the like. Instead, I'm going to connect back, possibly in some way, to Dror's paper on the question of what Jewish film is. And I'm going to come to it through study of one particular film, the sound film, Ace in the Hole, directed, written, and produced by Billy Wilder. Let me pull up. All right, can you see? Good. So this paper is part of a larger project that, because of the delay in being able to present this, brought about by the pandemic, I have completed and had accepted for publication, that deals with racial darkness, issues of Native American representation and Jewishness and Holocaust survivor guilt in this film, because those topics and race and ethnicity in particular have not really been dealt with. All right. 2021 quietly marks the 70th anniversary of the release of Austrian Jewish emigre Billy Wilder's biggest flop, or what he called his runt of the litter, Ace in the Hole. Hello, there we go. This film was the first for which Wilder claimed the titles of writer, director, and producer. It offers a prescient critique of tabloid sensationalism, including both the reporters who produce it and the audiences that devour it. Academic writing on the film has centered on this issue in particular, positing that the film's box office failure reflected its cynical attack on the very audiences who would be most likely to see it, as well as film critics. Little attention within the limited scholarship on Ace in the Hole has been paid to other subjects. This paper provides one productive avenue for redressing this lack, a consideration of Jewishness and Holocaust survivor guilt as unconscious driving forces for the film. No one would call this a Jewish film, but I want to talk about Jewish elements that I think are present in sometimes ironic and often subtle fashion, or unconsciously developed by Wilder. I posit that protagonist Chuck Tatum's self-loathing and images of literal and figurative entrapment and death in Ace in the Hole signify Wilder's working through, or the impossibility of working through, his guilt as a survivor. Well, there we go. Born Samuel, or Shmuel in Yiddish, and nicknamed for America's Billy the Kid, Austrian-born Jewish emigre director Billy Wilder fled Berlin with the rise of Hitler after achieving success as a screenwriter within the Weimar film industry of the 1920s. Coping with an unsuccessful attempt to bring his mother, stepfather, and grandmother with him to America, Wilder cast his lot with the Hollywood film industry, for which he wrote and directed, and then later even produced, successful films in genres from romantic comedy to film noir. As he worked, coping with the cultural divide between German and Hollywood methods of filmmaking, his family members were murdered by the Nazis. Already cynical, acerbic, and preoccupied with control, the Holocaust and Wilder's personal experience with survivor guilt became significant influences, I think particularly on his films of the 40s and 50s. In 1945, after a trip with Hollywood executives to view and film the liberation of camps in Germany, as he sought information about his mother and grandmother, Wilder edited the short film Death Mills, a 22-minute English language version of Die Todesmühlen, an 86-minute documentary intended as propaganda to educate German audiences about Nazi atrocities for which they are partially blamed. Some of the footage of Bombed Out Berlin was then later used in 1948 for A Foreign Affair, a combination of political propaganda and romantic comedy that Wilder directed. These scenes were, the film footage was taken in 45. Wilder did not go back when he filmed A Foreign Affair. So any location shooting does not include main characters in close-up or things like that, or else the background is projected. As a refugee from the rise of the Third Reich, we may find it no surprise that Wilder's Hollywood films are haunted by oppositions, such as home and homelessness, past and present, public and private, life and death, and self and other. The latter appears frequently in filmic alter egos for Wilder, such as Sunset Boulevard's Joe Gillis, the corrupt Hollywood writer and prodigal son, and even more so in Chuck Tatum of Ace in the Hole, 1951, a yellow journalist for tabloids, as Wilder also was in his youth, determined to achieve success by creating and controlling a story, as well as those people involved in it, somewhat like a director, and thereby, the character Tatum calculates, he will be able to control the trajectory of his own life. To begin to read Ace in the Hole through Jewishness and Holocaust survivor guilt, let us consider the ways in which Wilder immersed himself in making the picture. Having abandoned the tempering influence of Charles Brackett with the completion of Sunset Boulevard, Wilder was intent to venture out on his own. "I'm determined to scale obscure mountains," stated Wilder. "It doesn't matter what the other fellows say. They are straitjacketed by their studios, so naturally they have the knife out for me. They can't wait for me to slip into the crevasse." This extended metaphor vividly links Wilder's ambitious project with Ace in the Hole's doomed character Leo Minosa, a man who plans to bring forth a treasure, an Indian treasure from a cave, only to be buried by these desires. And Chuck Tatum is buried as well. He becomes a victim of a stabbing and of his own ambition. To advance a reading of Tatum as alter ego for Wilder, we can reach beyond the surface connections of tabloid journalism experience, cynical temperament, and determination to maintain control. Tatum in the film is also displaced, and as I read him, Jewish. He is not only an urban man in a small town, but also a New Yorker in New Mexico. The character shows his big city know-how when we see him arrive in Albuquerque in his convertible coupe towed by a local. So he doesn't drive in, he is driven in, and he's sitting there reading the paper as he comes into town, which he considers far beneath him. And he desires from the beginning of the film, very openly and vocally, to return to New York. By the time he gives his own eulogy as he dies in the final scene of the film, there seem to be only two things he has come to miss, and he expresses this quite vocally: chopped liver and garlic pickles. These items are not just big city staples, but signifiers for Jewish New York. Beyond such cultural markers, and there are a few other items that I discuss in a longer version, we can also link Tatum to Jewishness through the film's overt and covert religious allusions, such as suspenders that hang from his shirt like tzitzit in a scene, and in that same scene, a six-pointed deputy star that resembles the Star of David. Far plainer are the biblical allusions and implications in Tatum's announcement of Leo's death to the massive crowd that is gathered to gawk outside the cave, where he stands like Moses on the mountain. Here, Tatum, the tabloid sensationalist, figures himself as God's messengers among a doubting crowd. He even begins his announcement of Leo Minosa's death by shouting, "Listen!" A moment difficult not to read through the Shema. Although for the idol-worshipping crowds amassed beneath him, taking in Leo's entrapment as entertainment, this is the end of belief, not its declaration. Also noteworthy, the biblical Moses is a descendant of revered Jewish patriarch Jacob, which happens to be the given name of Tatum's Albuquerque newspaper editor, Jacob Q. Boot. This Jacob, like his namesake, has strong faith, directed at veracity rather than God, illustrated by a framed cross-stitching that reads, "Tell the truth." We see that here in this publicity still, but in the film, it's outside of his door. So before you come into his office, you're greeted with this cross-stitching reminding you to tell the truth, which Tatum scoffs at from the minute he notices that. Briefly, I also want to talk about survivor guilt in Ace in the Hole. According to biographer Tom Wood, Wilder's loss of his mother and grandmother and his experience in Berlin in 1945 left him, quote, a heartless cynic with an excessive contempt for humanity. Wilder himself, however, rejected such an extreme description. In an example that proves the point and qualifies levels of cynicism, Wilder related the Holocaust to his frustration with the financial failure of Ace in the Hole. When in Berlin in 1945, he was directly asked by a reporter how he had felt when he learned his mother had died at the hands of the Nazis. And I always pause and groan at the idea of a reporter asking it, how'd you feel? Question, it's crazy. Wilder pointedly concluded that such a question, quote, makes you wonder just how cynical Ace in the Hole really was. Its incredible cynicism, particularly of the character Tatum, was part of the reason for its failure, arguably, at the box office. But Wilder rejected the idea that the film was that cynical. However sarcastic he remained, Wilder certainly felt the impact of the Holocaust deeply, and resonances appear in direct relation to several of his films. For example, when filming scenes for A Foreign Affair, an assistant editor lamented how Allied bombings had destroyed the once magnificent city of Berlin. Wilder retorted that the Nazis were solely responsible for the destruction. To hell with those bastards, he shouted. They burned most of my family in their damned ovens. Such connections have rarely been brought to bear on readings of Ace in the Hole. One exception to this is an article by Molly Haskell for the 2014 Criterion edition of the film, in which Molly Haskell argues that Tatum, quote, bears the brunt of Wilder's angst, not just corruption, anxiety, but the survivor's guilt of a man whose family died in Auschwitz. As relates to the Holocaust, both creator and creation also suffer a complex combination of self-aggrandizement and self-loathing, with the key difference being Wilder's ability to turn his conflicting traits into successful art, in part by projecting them onto characters like Tatum. Beyond the film industry, survivor guilt offers a useful extra-textual explanation for how and why Wilder created what Leland Pogue describes as, quote, a parable of the irresponsible artist, unquote, featuring a protagonist arguably more perpetrator than victim. If Holocaust survivor guilt provides a persuasive contextual tool for understanding self-loathing in Ace in the Hole, we can also read significance beyond the specific character of Tatum. In overt terms, precious little guilt is expressed in the film. And this is another facet that I go into in more detail in a longer version. Instead of passionate display, the picture turns outward, provoking guilt in its audience. Viewers are encouraged to loathe the corruption they see in Tatum, in Leo's wife, Lorraine, and in those who want to make a buck from Leo's suffering. However, viewers are also invited to see themselves as potentially responsible, reflected in the thousands who flock to witness the cave rescue as a carnivalesque spectator sport. Moviegoers have purchased a ticket to take vicarious pleasure in watching the tragedy unfold, after all. So you have a frame, and outside of that frame, you have an audience who is also invited to see themselves reflected in the images of the crowd. In terms of Holocaust metaphor, the crowd at the cave, eating popcorn, riding the Ferris wheel, and singing a song and buying sheet music for it dedicated to Leo Minosa's suffering. They stand in for the figure of the bystander, doing wrong by doing nothing. Those in the film who help turn Leo Minosa's suffering into a circus neither actively aid the victim nor even pay much attention to him. You can't even see him in these images from the film. You can't even see the cave. They make money or they enjoy a strange vacation that betrays their apathy to the suffering of others, available for reading through today's dark tourism Holocaust industry. What then does it mean to silently, neutrally partake in watching the motion picture centered in this disturbing spectacle? Such questions read within the early post-Holocaust era of the picture's release, 2 years before Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl would first be published in English, for example. This may go far in explaining why American audiences, many of whom just wanted to forget the war, including both its perpetrators and its victims, disliked Ace in the Hole so vehemently. Stretching the symbolism further, Molly Haskell reads Leo Minosa as akin to Wilder's murdered grandmother, stepfather, and grandmother, for he was, quote, I'm sorry, snuffed in a cave that bears a metaphoric resemblance to a concentration camp. And Nancy Stephan Fleur sees Leo as, quote, a synecdoche for all the Jews of Europe who did not get out in time, unquote, dehumanized and murdered for the greater glory of a corrupt racist nation's self-image. If this means that Tatum stands in for Hitler or perhaps for propaganda minister Goebbels, the film can be read as illustrating the depth survivor guilt can reach, as the potentially self-loathing Jew Wilder or via Tatum renders himself actively responsible for the Holocaust, then invites an audience in to watch him pay for his self-imposed sins. I am drawn to a more tempered judgment. There is satire in the film and purpose in decrying the passivity of the masses. Audiences could leave the theater then and now determined not to be bystanders. So when we watch the film today on DVD or stream it on the Criterion channel or even consider it in light of recent anti-Semitic attacks and the rise of white nationalism, the film has meaning that can encourage active resistance. The failure of Ace in the Hole did not shift Wilder from his concerns over the ills of humanity, particularly in light of the Holocaust. The next film he directed was Stalag 17, 1953, based on a Broadway play about World War II that Wilder enjoyed. The film depicts American airmen in a Nazi prisoner of war camp who suspect that one of them is an informant. To the satisfaction of Paramount executives and his own relief, the film was a hit. The Jewish emigre thus showed he could continue to process his cynicism and his survivor guilt through directing successful movies, and this ability allowed his career to bounce back. There certainly are limits to reading a film through symbolism, metaphor, and creator psychology. Jewishness is absent from the film's overt images, and if we reduce the film to a manifestation of survivor guilt, we pathologize Wilder and deny the reality of the relatively collaborative environment in which the film, like almost all films, was conceived and written. My reading is perhaps most valuable as it reveals facets of a film that speaks in a complex manner of its time, its place, and its creator. By reading within and beyond its heartily acknowledged condemnation of tabloid journalism, gullible mass audiences, and consumerism in America at mid-century, we find underlying pathologies that say far more than surface realism indicates about identity, injustice, and death. Ultimately, we see how Billy Wilder, emigre, survivor, and highly successful Hollywood filmmaker, channeled his experience and his vision during an era of cultural transition into a film with greater poignancy and social resonance than has yet been acknowledged. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a fascinating paper. Well, let's open it up to questions and comments. Probably the easiest way, well, there are not so many of us, but if you want to use that little yellow hand sign, or you can also write question in the chat.
I have a comment for Dr. Aben David. Is that how you pronounce it? Is that right? Aben David? Oh, you're signing.
Dror.
Dror is your first name, and then last name is Aben David? Pardon? Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
What I want to say is I love the way you use intertitles to challenge the concept of national cinema. I have not heard that argument before. Is it your argument based on these experiences, or do you apply that argument in particular to specific films in your work?
I think it's my argument, you know, unless I find that someone else said it before, and I'm sure it can happen. It comes from two things. First of all, if you're in film studies or theater studies, procession studies, you know, and I started with theater and then continued with media, right? The concept is that theater is never the same, right? Every time you have a theatrical production, there are different actors, they interpret things differently, the audience is different, it's a different city, every production is, but a movie, you know, there we can relax, it's the same movie. Right? Ace in the Hole is always Ace in the Hole. If you see it on DVD, it's still the same movie. Only that it's not. And with silent films, even more so, because there are no two similar productions, right? There's a guy at the piano, right? So every movie has a different music. There are the actors behind the screen. And once you change the intertitles, you can change the entire story. There's no sounds. So basically, you cut, you paste, you change the whole story. And in some of the movies, they actually do that. They throw like half of the plot. They do something completely different. They have the characters say something else, right? So the idea of a national cinema becomes ridiculous because a silent film comes out, and they did them like in month, right? Henny Porton, she did these 2 films. She did Yiskor, she did 10 other films. They go to 13 different countries, and they're being cut and pasted in each country. And in an article in the newspaper, right, the director is fuming because he says, you know, I make this great film, and then every movie house that I go to, they snip it. They say, well, you know, I have to get like 10 showings today, so make it into 45 minutes. And some idiot with no education is cutting the film, right? And he says, well, they don't do that in the civilized countries. You know, it's only in Germany that we do that. And of course, he didn't know how badly they butchered his film in England. So, national cinema, right? The German Hamlet was starring a Danish woman, right? Metropolis, you know, was basically done elsewhere. And there's really no problem of language and accent. So all those actors are doing films everywhere. They're being shipped everywhere, right? So what makes it a German film, right? We all know that Osten West is the you know, first surviving Yiddish silent film, and it's being celebrated as a Yiddish film and distributed by the Center of Jewish Cinema, who of course does not mention the German intertitles and does not provide the German intertitles on the CD-ROM, which makes my work very hard because now I have to go to Vienna to get the German intertitles, and guess what? I can go nowhere, right? But it's not a Yiddish film; it's an Austrian film, right? So this whole thing is a construct.
That's fascinating.
I'll call on myself. So question or more comment for Elyce, and I think your argument makes a whole lot of sense and is really illuminating, especially if you place Ace on the Whole in the context of other films that deal with the Holocaust that come out in the 1950s. And I've written on that, and I've called it kind of the image of the unhinged survivor, the noir survivor. So if you think about The Juggler, where of course you have also Kirk Douglas, right, playing this unhinged survivor who ends up in Israel, or a number of other films with which Wilder certainly would have been familiar, right? So they all share, you know, those characters are they're all in between territory, right? They're of in the moral sense, but also psychologically, they're completely unhinged, and that seems to be kind of it's not unique and special American take on the survivor in that kind of early post-war period. So yeah, I wanted to hear what you think about that context. And I also had a question for Dror, based on what you said, kind of that this whole idea of silent Yiddish cinema doesn't make much sense. And I think Goldman, in his book on Yiddish film, he says, well, you know, I'm calling these silent films Yiddish films because of the audience, right? So since majority of the, you know, of the people in the audience would be Jews, would be Yiddish speakers, therefore we can classify them as Yiddish films. That struck me as not particularly convincing, but I wonder what you think about that argument.
He is wrong, and I love Goldman. It's a wonderful book. It really helped me, and I'm grateful because he is wrong. These films were popular in Austria. Some of them made it over to England, some made it to the States, some got a response in East European Jewish communities, but they were made for Austrians. Let me take you behind the stage just for 1 minute. Right, this is, I just found this yesterday and I'm excited. This is the Forward's 1924